Madison and I tied the knot 8 years back, right after college, as soon as we'd both nailed down stable jobs. We got serious right away about saving for a home we'd always dreamed of. I was set on starting a family, but Madison never shared that vision. In fact, she had zero interest in motherhood. This difference quickly became a source of friction between us. We'd met during our college years. She'd seemed fun and spontaneous then, though we never did anything too crazy. Our sex life was steady, even satisfying for the most part. One thing we really connected on back then was bird watching. In college, it was refreshing to find someone who enjoyed the outdoors as much as I did, eager to track down new species and share in the thrill of discovery. We first met on a birding hike and hit it off immediately. That first spark led us to our first real moment of intimacy in the woods, a place Madison took an immediate liking to. Over the years, she stuck to her casual, no-frills style, never interested in anything glamorous or frilly. With her shoulder-length brown hair and olive skin, she didn't need anything fancy. But her reluctance about kids? I couldn't shake the feeling it was partly driven by fear that motherhood would ruin her looks. Lately, work had become all-consuming for me, and I was stuck at the office for long hours, while Madison would get home earlier, change, and go bird watching until sundown, logging every single bird she spotted. I come home wiped out, sometimes crashing on the couch. I began to feel like I wasn't holding up my end as a husband, hoping Madison would show some sign of wanting intimacy. Instead, she seemed almost relieved when I didn't make a move, which left me more unsettled than I wanted to admit. I used to have a hot temper in my younger days, the kind that led to more than a few fights. By the end of high school, though, I'd learned to rein it in. Madison didn't know that part of me, and neither did my parents mention it around her. I decided to make some changes at work, scaling back a bit so I could spend more time with her. My boss was understanding, and I figured it was the first step to fixing things between us. I didn't think she was cheating, but I knew our relationship was strained from the lack of attention. One night, I floated the idea of a vacation. "Madison, how about we take a trip together?" I asked, hopeful. "Nah, I don't think we need that," she shrugged. "Maybe a short one if you can swing it. A week or two, somewhere quiet. We've barely spent any real time together recently. David, neither of us can just up and leave work like that. We're supposed to be saving for the house. Remember? I know, but don't you think we need time together too? I'm so beat after work, and weekends get eaten up by chores." She looked mildly annoyed. "I'm good with a short trip nearby. I just can't handle a whole vacation right now. Maybe I'm stressed about other things, but trust me, I'm happy. If there's a problem, you'll be the first to know. Just don't want you to look elsewhere," I said with a nervous laugh. She smirked in response, as if mocking the effort I was putting into this. That night, I didn't mention my new work hours and tried for some intimacy. She turned me down, claiming a headache. Her birdwatching log showed more outings than I'd noticed, with new sightings listed almost daily. I love my Honda 250 Rebel. It's fast, quiet, and manageable. A total contrast to those noisy Harleys.
No fuss, no hassle.
That day, I rode it to work and set up a plan. Madison usually got home by 4 p.m. Around that time, I told Laura, my secretary, that I'd be in the archives for the rest of the day and to call me on my cell when she left. I slipped out of the office through the back, wedging the fire exit open. Minutes later, I parked my Rebel a few blocks from home, well out of sight. Sure enough, Madison came home at her usual time, changed quickly, and took off for her so-called bird-watching outing. I knew exactly where she'd go, so I trailed her from a distance. Her Volvo was parked at the Rainbow Mountain trailhead, with a black BMW nearby. Familiar with the trails, I took an alternate route using my birding skills to stay out of sight. Near the top of the mountain, where the trails were rough but the views perfect for hawk watching, I stopped and scanned the area with my binoculars. The valley stretched out below, but I caught something else. Laughter. Giggling, actually. Moving cautiously, I tried to pinpoint the sound. A flash of yellow caught my eye. It was the lining of her vest. From my spot, I could see them clearly through my spotting scope. Madison's partner was Stanley Creighton, a coworker of hers who joined her company 6 months prior. I'd met him once or twice at work events. Stanley came across as an agreeable guy, with a wife who was quiet but polite, and 2 young sons. I used to admire his family life, even thinking I'd like something similar someday. But seeing him here with Madison made my stomach turn. I watched from my hidden vantage point as Stanley laid out a blanket. Madison was out of her jeans in seconds, every trace of modesty gone. The whole scene was primal and coarse, nothing loving about it. As rage simmered in me, I forced myself to stay put, fighting the urge to confront them. The encounter was over within minutes. They dressed quickly, laughing as they did, and Madison even kissed him on the cheek with a casualness that stung more than if it had been a kiss of passion. She didn't see me lying there, watching it all. I waited for them to part ways, then gathered my things and followed Madison from a safe distance. She was oblivious, walking ahead without a clue I was behind her. I stopped at the Hawk Mountain overlook, gazing down the valley. Moments later, I saw Stanley walking alone down the path. My insides were churning, but I kept myself steady. "What are you looking at?" Stanley's voice startled me as he stepped up behind me. "It's a red-tailed hawk, feeding its babies over in that pine," I said, pointing to a distant tree. He squinted, clearly unable to see. "Which tree?" "That one with the pine cones." I gestured again. He strained to see it, then turned to me. "Haven't we met before?" "Yes," I replied coolly. "I'm Madison's husband." His face went pale, and all he could say was, "Oh crap," before I shoved him over the edge. Time slowed as he plummeted, only a few seconds but enough to make it feel like an eternity. My phone buzzed, snapping me out of the moment. "Hi Laura, what's up?" I answered. "I'm heading out. Are you still downstairs?" "No, almost finished. I'll be back up soon." "All right. I left 2 letters on your desk for you to sign. They need to go out first thing tomorrow." "Got it, Laura. Thanks. See you tomorrow." Returning to the office took longer than I thought, but Laura was already gone. I signed one of the letters, then headed home, swapping my hiking boots for my Oxfords on the way, tossing the boots in a dumpster a few blocks from home. When I got home earlier than usual, Madison looked surprised. The next day, Stanley's body was found, and the news covered it that evening. Madison's reaction was a mix of shock and unease. I said, "He didn't show up at work, and people thought he might be sick, but his wife mentioned he hadn't come home. What was he doing on Rainbow Mountain? Did he even like bird watching?" I noticed her hesitation. "I don't think so," she replied slowly. Then she eyed me. "Did you go up there after work yesterday?" "No," I answered, watching her carefully. "Wonder if anyone else was around. It's usually deserted up there on weekdays. Guess I'll need to dig out the old black suit," I muttered, trying to keep things light, but Madison shot me a glare. She didn't appreciate my casual tone about her colleague's death. "Sorry, honey," I said, not entirely sincere. "I know you worked with Stanley. I wasn't trying to be insensitive." That night, I heard her quietly crying beside me after we went to bed. I let her be, too drained to offer comfort. 2 days later, a detective turned up at my office.
Im detectiva Mark Humphrey.
"Do you have a moment to answer a few questions?" "Of course. What's this about?" "Did you know Stanley Creighton?" "We worked for the same company, but I wouldn't say we were close. Only met him at a couple of work functions." "Is this about his accident up on Rainbow Mountain?" "Just clearing things up. Your wife and Stanley were close, and we're making sure there's no issue there." "Close?" "They worked together, that's it." The detective tilted his head slightly. "Your wife told us this morning she was actually with Stanley up on Rainbow Mountain just before his fall." "That's impossible," I replied, my blood going cold. "She told me she was home, doing laundry." He raised an eyebrow. "Well, it seems your wife has been seeing Stanley for over 3 months. Now, hold on a second." I cut in, barely containing my anger. "You can't go throwing accusations like that about my wife." "No accusation here, Mr. Reynolds. She disclosed it herself. As for the specifics, well, that's something for you and her to work out," he said, his voice calm but pointed. Are you trying to provoke me, or what? Easy there, Mr. Reynolds. This isn't about upsetting you. We also spoke to your secretary, Laura Bradshaw. She mentioned you spent most of Tuesday afternoon down in the basement, sorting files. Not the whole afternoon, I corrected. I was down there maybe 2 hours tops, then back in my office. I signed out around 5:30, 6-ish. The guard on duty said it was closer to 4 to 6. The detective noted, watching my reaction. Sounds right. I wasn't clocking the minutes. Just wanted to get home to my wife, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Your wife mentioned you got home around 6. That's a 10-minute drive at most, he added. Did she also mention I was there the whole evening? I asked, my patience thinning. Relax, Mr. Reynolds. We're just covering our bases, ensuring nothing gets overlooked, he said. Then he paused. You really didn't know about your wife's relationship with Stanley, did you? No, I said through clenched teeth. But I'm sure it'll be the hot topic at dinner tonight. Detective Humphrey handed me his card, muttered a quick goodbye, and left. My hands were shaking with anger. As soon as the door clicked shut, I threw my stapler across the room just as Laura walked in, startled. David, I hope I didn't mess anything up, she said, concerned. Nah, Laura, you're fine. I appreciate you being honest with them. No problem, boss. If you need anything, just let me know, she replied gently. Thanks, Laura. I may take a few days off. One thing was clear in my mind. I had no intention of fixing things with Madison anymore. All I wanted now was a clean, straightforward divorce. Thankfully, we didn't have any kids, and we were only renting, so it wouldn't be too messy. I'd always wanted children, but right then, I was grateful Madison had been so against the idea. It wasn't even 3 p.m., but I decided I'd had enough of work for the day. Laura understood. We had $775,000 saved up in our house account. On a whim, I withdrew $63,000 and headed to the dealership nearby. 2 hours later, I was driving a bright yellow Hummer off the lot, lighter by $58,000. A new house was out of the picture now, and honestly, I couldn't have cared less about gas prices at that moment. When Madison saw the Hummer parked outside, she stormed out, her face red with fury. What's that? She demanded. It's my new ride, I replied coolly. I figured I could use something a bit more exciting. Are you out of your mind? She spat. How on earth are we supposed to afford it? Relax, I said casually. I paid cash. With what? She looked alarmed. Did you take it from our house fund? I'm a single guy now. No need for a house. So yeah, I got myself the Hummer instead, I said flatly. As people around us started to take notice, Madison grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the house. What do you mean, single guy? She asked, her voice shaking. You know exactly what I mean. I shot back. Why would I want a house with you? Why would I even stick around? David, this is absurd, she said, trying to calm me down. Can we just talk this through, like reasonable adults? Oh, by the way, I added, my voice icy. Detective Humphrey paid me a visit today. He filled me in on your little get-together with Stanley Creighton on Rainbow Mountain. Funny, because you told me you were at home doing laundry. Care to explain? Madison looked cornered, but tried to play innocent. I didn't want to upset you. Stanley was going through a rough patch with his wife, and he didn't have anyone else to talk to. I was just being a friend. Really? Why not meet at a Denny's or a Starbucks then? Why drag him all the way up to Rainbow Mountain? Stanley was emotional. He didn't want to break down in a crowded place. I thought it would be easier for him up there, she said quietly, watching me closely. I stared at her, seeing through every lie. This is all nonsense, Madison, and you know it. You and Stanley have been sneaking around for months, lying to me and to his wife. I'm done with these games. Either grow up or cut it out. She crossed her arms, defiant. You have no idea what you're talking about. Just because you're throwing around accusations doesn't make them true. Stanley and I were just friends. If you think you have proof, then show it. I felt trapped, knowing that while I did have proof, Showing it would mean revealing that I'd been on Rainbow Mountain myself. My fists clenched as I tried to hold back my frustration. I've got photos, Madison. Think those might be proof enough for you. She blinked, suddenly unsure. Photos? Where? I took a slow, steady breath. Photos of the two of you getting cozy in a motel room. I lied, unable to reveal the real pictures I had of their escapade. Madison's face went pale when I confronted her. You're lying, she spat, realizing she'd slipped up trying to cover herself. Her glare turned cold, her lips trembling with contempt. You piece of work. I'm done with this conversation, and let me tell you, you're not divorcing me. You can go sleep in that flashy truck of yours, because you're not stepping foot in my bed anytime soon. Maybe never. Make your own dinner. Leave me alone. By the way, are we still going to the funeral tomorrow? Forget it, I muttered, tired of the whole charade. The funeral felt surreal. Stanley and his wife, Megan, were from out of town, so I couldn't understand why she'd chosen to bury him here. Maybe the grief was too much for her to take him back home. The crowd was mostly people from Madison and Stanley's office. After the service, a line formed to offer condolences to Megan. When we got close, Megan sent her kids off with a friend and turned her gaze sharply on Madison. Madison stretched out her hand, but Megan wasn't having it. You've got some nerve coming here, Megan hissed, her voice cold and controlled. You tore apart my marriage and destroyed my family, and now you dare to show your face at his funeral? If I see you again, I'll rip you to pieces. Count on it. Madison was stunned, standing there speechless. She tried to say something, but thought better of it and stormed back to the car, her face flushed. A few people nearby caught the exchange and looked on uncomfortably. I glanced at Megan, who stared back at Madison with a fury that could have cut steel. I'm sorry if Madison hurt you, I said, feeling useless. I'm sure she didn't mean it. Megan's expression hardened. You're defending her? She cheated on you, and here you are apologizing on her behalf? Go home and comfort your cheating wife. I don't need your pity or your cluelessness. She turned away, dismissing me. I nodded slightly and headed back to the car, wondering how I'd even manage to get through the day without losing my temper. Madison sat in sullen silence on the way home, but as soon as we got inside, she exploded. You jerk! You knew exactly what would happen at that funeral. Why did you drag me there just to humiliate me? Don't tell me it was for your office buddies. Why did Megan single you out? Forget it, Madison. You're full of it, I muttered, done with her excuses. She glared at me, then stormed off, slamming the door behind her. I didn't hear a word from her for the rest of the day. I ended up sleeping in the spare room that night, feeling strangely relieved. Any desire for closeness with her had long since faded. The next day, around noon, I drove over to Megan's place. I had no idea what I'd say, but I felt I owed her an apology. She was in the garage with her boys, sorting through boxes. Hey, sorry to drop by unannounced, I started. I wanted to apologize for anything I might have done yesterday to upset you. Megan glanced at me, barely stopping her work. Finally, she spoke, sounding exhausted. Look, I have a lot to deal with. My husband left a mess behind, and I'm trying to figure out how to move forward. I don't have the energy for apologies. Is there something I can help you with? I hesitated, then offered. Actually, I could help if you want. I have some time. She gave me a long look, sizing me up. All right, if you're serious, grab some trash bags and follow me. We went inside to the master bedroom, and she pointed to Stanley's closet and dresser. Take everything out and bag it up. Drop it off at Goodwill when you're done. Think you can handle that? Sure can, I said, rolling up my sleeves. She introduced me to her boys, Alex and Chris. Guys, this is Mr. Reynolds. He's helping us bag up Dad's clothes to take away. Both boys shook my hand. Alex looked around 8, Chris about 6. Watching those boys brought a pang of regret. They were the kind of kids I'd always dreamed of having. Soon, the three of us were loading bags of clothes and shoes into the Hummer. After dropping off the bags downtown, I returned to Megan's house. She met me at the door, looking drained but appreciative. "You don't have to keep doing this, Mr. Reynolds," she said. "You shouldn't feel responsible for what Madison did." "Do you know what really happened?" I asked. "Or are you just piecing things together?" "A bit of both," she admitted quietly. "But I'd rather not discuss it in front of the boys. Can we talk later?" "Sure," I said. "I can come by tomorrow. If you need, I can help clear out the basement or garage." She nodded, grateful. "That sounds good. I'll miss having the boys around, though." Driving away, I felt a strange blend of relief and guilt. Stanley's death haunted me. Yet there was something in Megan's eyes that suggested she wasn't exactly mourning her loss either. Meanwhile, Madison's stubborn refusal to end things between us made no sense. Why cling to a broken marriage? When I got home, the smell of chili wafted through the house. I figured I'd try to get her talking. "Madison, with everything that's happened, don't you think it might be time to consider a separation?" I asked, keeping my tone level. "No, I don't," she replied flatly, stirring the pot without looking up. "I have no reason to leave. It's clear you and Stanley were more than friends," I pressed. "Our goals never aligned, did they?" "There's not much to discuss, David. Spending time with Stanley made me realize we didn't want the same things. You wanted a stay-at-home mom, while I wanted more out of life. I didn't bring it up because I didn't want to hurt you. Isn't that just more reason to call it quits? Why drag this out?" I asked, struggling to keep calm. "Absolutely not. I'm not about to give up my home and the comforts I've built here. I haven't done anything to deserve being thrown out." "Well, if that's the way it's going to be, I guess we're just roommates now," I said with a sigh. "I'm not done fighting for what's mine," she snapped back. "What exactly are you holding on to?" I demanded, my frustration breaking through. "I don't want to discuss it," she hissed. "Just drop it." Dinner was silent, and her chili was unbearably spicy. Later that evening, I started feeling queasy, making repeated trips to the bathroom. It wasn't long before I was hunched over, nauseous and dizzy. "Madison, I'm really sick. Can you take me to the clinic?" I asked, my voice weak. "No way. Desperate Housewives is about to start. If your stomach hurts, take a Tums," she said, barely glancing at me. "It's more serious than that. Please," I pleaded. "Drive yourself if it's that bad." "Stop being such a baby," she retorted coldly. I grabbed my keys and staggered outside, where my neighbor saw me struggling. He offered to drive me to the hospital, and I barely remember the ride there. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed with sunlight streaming in. Turning my head, I saw Detective Humphrey sitting nearby, reading a magazine. "Good afternoon, Mr. Reynolds," he said, glancing up with a knowing expression. "I thought you were planning to sleep all day," Detective Humphrey said as I blinked myself awake, disoriented. "Why are you here? What happened? And what time is it?" I asked, struggling to make sense of things. "Easy now," he replied calmly. "I'll be the one asking the questions. Just relax, and it'll all come back to you." "Sorry, I'm just feeling a bit on edge," I muttered, trying to gather myself. "That's understandable," he said, leaning back in his chair. "David, it looks like you had a bit of bad chili last night. Luckily, your neighbor got you here just in time. The doctors treated you for poisoning. They found rat poison in your system." "That woman," I snapped. "What did she say?" "She gave us the leftover chili to test," Humphrey explained, looking skeptical. "It was clean. She insists she has no clue how the poison got into your meal and even claims she ate the same thing and was fine. We searched the house and garage but came up empty." "So what now?" I asked, frustrated. "Nothing immediate," he replied as a doctor and nurse walked in. The doctor gave me a quick exam while the nurse drew another blood sample. Afterward, they said I could go home when I felt ready and handed me a paper listing bland foods for recovery. I borrowed Detective Humphrey's phone to call Megan and apologize for missing our meeting. When I handed the phone back, Humphrey looked at me with a serious expression. "David, I have to ask, why would your wife want to kill you? Why did she kill Stanley Creighton?" I shot back. "You have proof of that yet?" No, he admitted, his eyes narrowing. But she was on Rainbow Mountain with him. She was the last person to see him alive. Humphrey offered me a ride home, and when we arrived, Madison put on a surprisingly apologetic front, saying she regretted not being there for me. I went straight to the spare room and closed the door. I didn't trust anything she touched in the kitchen, so I wasn't about to eat anything she'd cooked. The next morning, I called Laura to let her know I'd be taking a sick day and asked if she could help me find an apartment. Somehow, she already seemed to know what had happened. I waited until Madison left for work, then started packing my things, prepared to move out at a moment's notice if needed. It frustrated me to no end that the police couldn't take action against Madison despite everything. After a quick breakfast at IHOP, I drove over to see Megan. The boys were in school, and Megan seemed deeply upset. Not just about Stanley's death, but everything unraveling. I assured her I'd come back later after dealing with some personal matters. Madison may have been against divorce, but she clearly had no problem wishing me harm. That left only two options. She either wanted revenge or money. I took a trip to see my insurance agent. It was a risky move, but I had taken out $1 million life insurance policy right after we got married, with Madison as the beneficiary. Even though the premiums were steep, the cash value had built up to over $166,000. I cashed it in, then canceled the collision and comprehensive coverage on her Volvo. I also terminated her medical and dental coverage through my company. While the medical insurance would last for 90 days, the dental would be gone by the end of the month. Lastly, I changed the beneficiary on my company insurance policies to my mother. When I returned to the office, Laura greeted me warmly, offering her help with anything I needed. A quick visit to the bank revealed that Madison had already drained the remaining balance of our house fund, a whopping $112,000. After explaining the situation, the bank manager set up everything to close out our joint credit cards and checking account once I gave the word. I opened a new account under my name and finalized the paperwork. Later, I swung by the house, and Madison was there, dressed in her usual bird-watching gear. We kept things cordial, barely polite. She mentioned she was heading up to Rainbow Mountain for some bird-watching and relaxation. The whole setup felt suspicious, but I played along, letting her think I hadn't caught on. Once she left, I hopped on my Rebel motorcycle and followed. When I reached the upper lot, her Volvo was parked beside a gray Ford Ranger. I rode down to the lower lot and saw her mountain bike chained to a tree. I hid my Honda in some nearby bushes, prepared for the uphill climb. It was a grueling hike, but after a few minutes, I reached the top and ducked behind a rock outcropping. There, I saw Madison talking to a man who was holding a strange tool. She handed him a photo and an envelope. He examined the picture, then opened the envelope and thumbed through a thick stack of cash. They shook hands, and Madison started heading my way. I pressed myself against the ledge, hidden from view as she passed. The man stayed behind, glancing up and down the trail as if waiting for someone. I had a good guess as to who. Madison must have expected me to follow her, assuming I'd come from the lot where her car was parked. I took a quicker downhill path, and when I reached the bottom, her bike was gone. I got back on my Honda and returned to the upper lot. The Ford Ranger was unlocked, and I found a jogging outfit on the front seat. I took the registration from the glove box, a matchbook from the console, and the jogging pants. Twisting the pants tightly, I soaked them in my Honda's gas tank. After drenching both ends, I stuffed the pants into the truck's gas tank, lit the match, and got out of there fast. Halfway down the mountain, I heard the explosion echo behind me. I could only hope Madison had paid her contact enough to handle the aftermath. I took back roads to avoid crossing paths with her and eventually pulled into our driveway, parking the motorcycle behind the garage. To keep up appearances, I grabbed the lawn fertilizer spreader and started pushing it back and forth across the lawn, even though it was empty. A few minutes later, Madison pulled up and gave me a once-over, clearly disappointed. Before she could say anything, I asked, "Hey, where's the Volvo? You left in it, but now you're on the bike. What's going on?" She stumbled over her words, and then her phone rang. Turning away, she took the call, but I couldn't catch the conversation. Whoever was on the line sounded agitated. David, I left the Volvo up on the mountain and biked home for some exercise, she said, her voice a bit too casual. I know it's odd, but can you drive me back up to get it? Honey, that doesn't make any sense, I replied, feigning confusion. But sure, let's go. The whole drive was tense. She fidgeted nervously, glancing out the window. As we neared the mountain road, we saw several fire trucks rushing toward the top. A police officer stopped us halfway up. Sorry, folks, he said. There's been an incident up on the mountain. A truck caught fire. We're not allowing any traffic through right now. My wife's car is parked up there. Could we walk up and get it? The officer radioed in, then replied, You can hike up, and an officer will escort you past the fire trucks to retrieve the car. Don't wait for me, Madison said, stepping out of the Hummer. Thanks for the ride. I watched her until she was out of sight, then quietly followed. The commotion on the mountain made it easy to tail her without being noticed. When she reached the top, the man she'd been with earlier approached her, gesturing wildly. I couldn't hear the words, but it was clear they were arguing. Madison seemed to be trying to calm him down, but he wasn't having it. After about 10 minutes, he stormed off to speak to the fire chief. Madison and her accomplice got into the Volvo, and I hurried back to the Hummer. I managed to drive off just before they turned the corner. Back home, I hopped on my Honda and went to visit Megan, arriving a bit later than planned. She asked about what had happened, so I gave her a watered-down version, leaving out the more explosive details. The next morning, while she was in the shower, I took the SIM card out of her phone. Once she'd left for work, I closed our accounts, canceled her phone service, paid a $200 fee just to be rid of it, and put in disconnection orders for the landline, DSL, and cable. I let our landlord know I'd be moving out and told him to reach out to Madison for a new rental agreement. By the week's end, the water and electricity would be cut off. With a few bags packed in the Hummer, I was ready to leave. Laura had left a note at work saying Detective Humphrey wanted me to give him a call, so I headed straight to his office. Well, look who's still kicking, Humphrey greeted with a smirk. What's that supposed to mean? Humphrey chuckled. Do you know a guy named Adam Flatshare? Never heard of him, I replied, handing over the Ford registration I'd found. He glanced at it, raising an eyebrow. Interesting, he murmured. By the way, your wife's been in contact with a man named Adam Thornton, a known convict. She called him 6 times, he called her 4, all just in the past week. She also withdrew $12,000 from an account 3 days ago. Any idea why she might want me out of the picture? I asked sarcastically. Well, considering she thought you had $1 million life insurance policy, there's plenty of reason, he said, giving me a pointed look. But since you canceled it, her incentive might be shrinking. Does she know it's canceled? Doubt it. And we've had a little chat with Adam too. I made it clear he'd be our first suspect if anything happened to you. He wasn't happy about the extra scrutiny. But honestly, we don't know if that'll be enough to deter your wife. I've already moved out, Humphrey. I don't know what else I can do. Mark leaned back in his chair, studying me. I have a feeling you're not telling me everything, David. The pieces don't quite add up. Just keep your guard up. I left the station and headed to Megan's place. She was glad to see me, and over lunch, I tried to explain the situation without going into every detail. There was so much I wanted to say, but I didn't want to pull her too deep into my problems. She noticed my hesitation and gave me a few puzzled looks, but let it go, skillfully shifting the conversation to lighter topics. By the end of lunch, she'd convinced me to come back for dinner, and I felt more at ease than I had in weeks. The next morning, ready to get back to work, I felt something like relief. Spending time with Alex and Chris had been a blast, and I was genuinely looking forward to the weekend with Megan. For the first time, I realized I didn't miss Madison at all. In fact, I was relieved she was no longer part of my life. I got into the Hummer feeling surprisingly optimistic. But as I started down the first hill, something felt wrong. The brakes wouldn't respond. My stomach tightened, and I broke into a cold sweat. I'd always thought movie characters were overdramatic about losing control of their cars. But now I got it. Trying to shut off the engine didn't work. The key wouldn't turn in gear, and shifting into park wasn't an option at that speed. The Hummer kept accelerating, hurtling toward traffic and intersections. I scanned the left side of the road. A cemetery bordered by a grassy slope rose from the street. It was my only chance. I aimed for the slope and yanked the handbrake, the Hummer jerking into a 180-degree spin before flipping over as it hit the slope. Darkness swallowed everything. When I came to, I was back in a hospital room. The pain was intense, but I sensed people bustling around me. A nurse checked my vitals, and I struggled to stay conscious through the fog. Finally, a doctor appeared, his voice a soothing murmur. In the flurry of white coats, I spotted Megan at the end of the bed. Just seeing her there brought a rush of relief. Before I knew it, exhaustion pulled me back under. The next time I opened my eyes, the room was quiet. Megan was there, asleep in a chair beside me, her presence a comfort I hadn't felt in years. My entire body ached, but seeing her made it all feel bearable. "Hey, are you awake?" I whispered. She looked up, blinking sleepily, and then smiled. "Thought I was dreaming," she joked, leaning in. "I'm glad you're okay. Thanks for being here," I murmured, my eyes growing heavy again. "Anytime," she replied softly, and I drifted back to sleep, feeling a strange peace. The next morning, I woke up a bit more alert but still sore all over. I glanced around the room, surprised to find it bustling with medical staff, but Megan was gone. Her absence left a small pang, and I was left wondering where she'd gone. The doctors bombarded me with questions about my pain levels and vision, but I had plenty of questions of my own. I asked about Madison, who had apparently signed the hospital admission forms but hadn't been seen since. They informed me I'd been out for 2 days. Megan visited daily, and Detective Hamfrey had been checking in regularly. My injuries included a concussion, a broken collarbone, a fractured arm, and 3 broken ribs. Painful but, thankfully, nothing life-threatening. The doctors seemed most concerned about the 2-day blackout. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they brought me some soup to take the edge off my hunger. Later, Mark dropped by. "I thought you were keeping an eye on things," I muttered, trying to joke through the discomfort. "Sorry, we didn't see this coming." "Any idea what went down?" "Someone cut the brake lines on the Hummer and disabled the airbags. I went through the windshield, and the seat belt did a number on my ribs as I got thrown out. There was no fire, thank God, but the Hummer's totaled. Honestly, I didn't like it much anyway. Speaking of which, any news on Madison? I know she signed the paperwork here, but that's all I've heard." "I tried calling her, but her phone's disconnected," Mark said, his face serious. "She was unhappy about the situation. A cop gave her a ride home after she finished the paperwork. I asked if she wanted to see you, but she didn't think it was necessary. So you've seen her more recently than I have. Did she leave town?" "We checked the house," he replied. "Her purse was there with around $8,000 in cash, but she left behind her driver's license, credit cards, and other personal stuff. Doesn't look like she'd have left town without those. We're considering her a missing person for now." "Any idea how the Hummer was sabotaged?" "Not a clue." "What about Adam Flatshare?" "Oddly enough, he's in a hospital in Philly," Mark said, raising an eyebrow. "2 guys took him there and told him in no uncertain terms that nothing was to happen to you." I shook my head in disbelief. "Mark, I don't know anyone in Philly. I've got no idea who'd go to bat for me like that." Mark looked at me closely and nodded. "I believe you. Well, if you need anything, just let me know. How about a guard at the door?" I joked, managing a small smile. He chuckled as he left, and not long after, Megan came in. "Hey," she said, smiling warmly. "The doc says you're good to go tomorrow if you've got somewhere to stay. I told him you'd be with me. I've got all the care instructions and a nurse will come by daily. The doctor will check in with you next week." "That sounds good to me. Who's giving me my sponge baths?" I teased. "You or the nurse, your choice," she replied, smirking. "Well, as long as my legs work, I can manage the bathroom on my own. I'll be fine eating at the table like a normal person, too." The pain meds made me queasy, so I tried to cut back on them early. Megan and the boys were great company during my recovery. The first week, we stayed indoors, but eventually, I convinced her to drive me by the old house. The landlord was there, wondering if he could rent it out since Madison was still considered missing. We came up with a plan to sort through what was left and clear out any remaining items. Laura visited while I was staying with Megan, and the two of them got along well, often joking and keeping me updated on work gossip.